It is early morning, mid-1943. Hundreds of miles from land. Beneath the surface, a steel hull drifts at periscope depth. Inside, the air is stale. Diesel fumes cling to uniforms. Sweat beads on metal bulkheads. Men whisper without speaking. Above them, a Japanese merchant ship cuts a slow line through the water. No escorts close by. No warning shots. Just cargo. Rice. Steel. The lifeblood of an empire at war. A sonar operator listens. A faint echo returns. The submarine turns almost imperceptibly. Torpedo tubes are flooded. Calculations are made in silence. Speed, angle, distance. No heroics. No speeches. Just procedure. When the torpedoes strike, the ocean does not roar. It exhales. A dull concussion travels through the hull. The merchant ship lists. Then burns. Then disappears. By nightfall, there will be no record of this moment in headlines. No photographs. No victory parade. Only a line crossed off a shipping ledger in Tokyo, and a problem Japan cannot replace. This is not a battle for territory or glory. It is a war against movement itself. And it has been building long before this quiet morning at sea. Before this tactic could choke an empire, the conditions that made it possible had already been set. Long before the first American torpedo found a Japanese merchant hull, the fate of the empire had already been written into its geography. Japan was an island nation with few natural resources. No significant oil fields. Limited iron ore. Insufficient food production for its growing population. Every modern industry, steelmaking, aviation, mechanized warfare, depended on imports that had to cross open water. Coal from China. Oil from the Dutch East Indies. Rubber from Malaya. Rice from Southeast Asia. All of it moved by ship. By the 1930s, Japan's leaders understood this vulnerability. The solution, in their view, was expansion. If Japan could seize resource-rich territories and secure the sea lanes between them, the empire could sustain itself. This logic drove the invasions of Manchuria in 1931, China in 1937, and eventually Southeast Asia after 1941. War was not only ideological or political, it was logistical. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it did so with confidence in its navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy was designed for decisive surface engagements. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. Its doctrine focused on annihilating enemy fleets in dramatic clashes. Submarines existed, but they were assigned to hunt warships, not cargo vessels. Commerce raiding was considered secondary, even dishonorable. The United States Navy entered the war with a different inheritance, and many of its own blind spots. American submarines were modern and numerous. On paper, they represented one of the most advanced undersea forces in the world. But doctrine lagged behind technology. Before the war, U.S. naval planners still believed submarines would operate cautiously, scouting for fleets rather than strangling supply lines. There was no pre-war plan for an unrestricted submarine campaign against Japan's merchant marine. The first months of the Pacific War exposed the consequences. American submarines were sent into enemy waters almost immediately. They found targets. They fired torpedoes. And again the weapons failed. Some ran too deep. Others detonated prematurely. Many struck the hulls of Japanese ships and did nothing at all. Reports came back from patrol after patrol. Skippers were blamed. Crews were questioned. 4 months, the Navy refused to accept that the Mark 14 torpedo and its magnetic exploder were fundamentally flawed. Meanwhile, Japanese shipping continued to move. In 1942, the submarine force sank ships, but nowhere near the numbers required to make a strategic impact. Patrols were often isolated, uncoordinated, and reactive. There was no system. No sustained pressure. Just individual successes scattered across a vast ocean. Japan, for its part, barely noticed. The Imperial Japanese Navy assumed the submarine threat was manageable. Escort vessels were limited. Convoys were rare. Merchant ships often sailed alone or in small groups, relying on speed and distance for protection. Anti-submarine training was minimal. Sonar technology lagged behind Allied developments. Mines were few. Air patrols were inconsistent. This complacency was rooted in experience. During World War I, submarine warfare had devastated maritime empires. But Japan had not been on the receiving end. Its leaders underestimated how quickly undersea warfare had evolved, and how quietly it could decide a war. By mid-1942, the Pacific conflict was already expanding. Battles raged at Midway and Guadalcanal. Carriers clashed. Marines fought for airstrips. Headlines followed the drama of surface combat. Below the surface, however, another war was beginning to take shape. One that would not depend on victory in a single battle. One that would not announce itself. One that would grow stronger not through force of arms, but through patience, mathematics, and denial. The environment was set. The weaknesses were known. What remained was a shift in thinking, one that would transform American submarines from scattered hunters into a systematic weapon of economic collapse. That shift would come slowly, under pressure, and with consequences neither side fully grasped at the time. By late 1942, the Pacific War was no longer defined by shock or surprise. It had become a contest of endurance. The United States was mobilizing an industrial output unmatched in history. Shipyards worked around the clock. New submarines slid into the water every month. Crews trained faster, learned harder lessons, and returned to patrol with experience carved into routine. Losses were studied. Failures were logged. Patterns began to emerge. Quietly, the U.S. Navy started to change the way it thought about submarines. The first shift was technical, and overdue. After months of denial, investigations finally confirmed what submarine crews had been reporting since the first days of the war. The Mark 14 torpedo was running too deep. Its magnetic exploder was unreliable. Contact detonators bent instead of firing. Beginning in mid-1943, commanders authorized field modifications. Magnetic exploders were disabled. Depth settings were corrected. Reliability increased almost immediately. The results were measurable. Sinkings rose. Confidence returned. More importantly, commanders began to realize that submarine warfare could be something more than isolated patrols. Could be organized pressure. At the same time, intelligence improved. Signals intelligence units began to crack portions of Japanese naval and merchant shipping communications. Convoy routes, departure times, and cargo types became clearer. Submarines were no longer searching blindly across thousands of miles. They were being guided toward arteries. This was the beginning of a quiet but radical change in strategy. Rather than seeking dramatic engagements, U.S. submarine commanders began targeting choke points. Narrow seas, harbor approaches, strait crossings, places where shipping could not disperse. The South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, the approaches to the home islands. These were not chosen for spectacle, but for inevitability. Japan's merchant fleet, once expansive, was now stretched thin. Ships were moving longer distances. Repairs took time. Replacement hulls were scarce. Unlike the United States, Japan could not rapidly replace losses. Its shipyards were already burdened with naval construction. Steel was rationed. Skilled labor was limited. Still, the Imperial Japanese Navy resisted change. Convoy systems were implemented slowly and inconsistently. Escort vessels were often older ships or hastily converted patrol craft with limited anti-submarine capability. Coordination between Navy and merchant authorities was poor. Air cover was scarce. Fuel shortages restricted training. Radar adoption lagged behind Allied standards. Most critically, Japan failed to treat the merchant marine as a strategic priority. Ships continued to sail with predictable routes and schedules. Cargo manifests were rarely altered. Defensive measures were reactive, not anticipatory. Each loss was treated as an isolated incident, not a symptom of systemic failure. American submarines exploited this. By 1943, patrol reports showed a clear pattern. Sinkings were no longer random. Entire shipping lanes were thinning. Certain routes saw traffic drop sharply, not because demand had fallen, but because ships were no longer arriving. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies declined. Coal deliveries slowed. Food imports fell. The effects were not immediate on the battlefield, but they accumulated in factories, airfields, and fleet anchorages. Warships began to ration fuel. Training flights were reduced. Industrial output became erratic. None of these changes were publicly acknowledged, but they were felt across the Japanese war economy. This was the essence of the tactic that would later be recognized as decisive. American submarines were not seeking a single knockout blow. They were executing a campaign of subtraction. Each ship sunk removed capacity that could not be restored. Each route disrupted increased risk across the system. Over time, movement itself became dangerous. By the end of 1943, the numbers told a clear story. Submarines accounted for a growing share of Japanese shipping losses. The curve was rising. The pressure was constant. And for the first time, Japanese planners began to understand that the war was being lost not only in the air or on the ground, but in the spaces between. What had started as a corrective measure had become a doctrine. a doctrine that relied on invisibility, on restraint, on the understanding that wars can be decided not by what is destroyed, but by what is no longer able to move. This shift in thinking would now shape every patrol, every decision, and every life aboard an American submarine as the campaign entered its most lethal phase. The human cost, the tactical execution, and the enemy's slow realization would define what came next. The success of the submarine campaign did not begin with charts or doctrines. It began with men sealed inside steel cylinders, living in conditions designed for endurance rather than comfort. Life aboard an American submarine in the Pacific was defined by confinement. Space was rationed. Bunks were shared. Fresh water was limited. Heat built up as patrols pushed closer to the equator. Food spoiled quickly. The smell of diesel oil and unwashed clothing never fully disappeared. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months. There was no daylight, no horizon, only instruments and routine. Crew members learned to measure time by watch rotations and meals. Stress was constant, but outward emotion was controlled. Silence was a weapon. These men were not chasing enemy warships in dramatic engagements. They were waiting, listening, calculating. The work demanded patience more than aggression. A single mistake could bring depth charges. A single sound could reveal position. The enemy was unseen until the moment it wasn't. Losses were personal. Submarines that failed to return left no wreckage, no survivors. Crews knew the risks. They continued regardless. American submarines gradually became the most effective instruments of maritime interdiction in the Pacific. Radar allowed detection at night and in poor weather. Improved sonar helped track targets below the surface. Fire control systems evolved, allowing more accurate torpedo solutions. But the real advantage was integration. Submarines began sharing information. Contact reports were relayed. Patrol areas were adjusted dynamically. While true wolfpack tactics were limited by communication constraints, coordination improved. The ocean became mapped not just by charts, but by experience. Command decisions mattered. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, who assumed command of the Pacific Submarine Force in 1943, was instrumental in reforming tactics and confronting technical failures. He trusted his skippers. He demanded accountability from manufacturers. He encouraged initiative within clear strategic goals. Lockwood understood that submarines did not need to win glory. They needed to win time, and deny it to the enemy. Under this leadership, aggressiveness was paired with discipline. Patrol zones were chosen for effect, not opportunity. Risk was calculated. Losses were mourned, not romanticized. This convergence of human endurance, technological refinement, and command clarity transformed the submarine force into something more than a collection of boats. It became a system. One that Japan was ill-prepared to face, especially as the perspective shifted across the water. Because while American submariners were adapting to silence and pressure, their adversary was struggling to understand what kind of war was being waged against them. That enemy perspective would define the next phase of the campaign. From the Japanese side, the submarine threat remained misunderstood for far too long. Imperial Japanese naval doctrine was built around decisive fleet engagements. Training emphasized gunnery, maneuver, and carrier operations. Anti-submarine warfare was a secondary concern, often assigned to older ships or lightly equipped patrol craft. Depth charges were limited. Sonar operators were poorly trained. Coordination between surface escorts and aircraft was inconsistent. Merchant captains received minimal defensive instruction. Many sailed without zigzagging. Convoys, when used, were often small and predictable. Escorts lacked the speed or endurance to remain with freighters across long routes. Air patrols were sparse, especially as fuel shortages worsened. Even as losses mounted, Japanese leadership hesitated to divert resources from offensive naval units to protect shipping. Warships took priority. Carriers and battleships consumed fuel and manpower while the merchant fleet bled quietly. American submarines were not trying to defeat Japan's navy directly. They were targeting its ability to function. Every modern military depends on logistics. Fuel to move ships and aircraft. Food to sustain troops and civilians. Raw materials to build weapons. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, and every mile increased vulnerability. By focusing on merchant shipping, the United States attacked the foundation of Japanese power. This was not attrition in the traditional sense. It was systemic collapse. As shipping losses accumulated, shortages amplified. One missing tanker meant multiple grounded aircraft. One sunk freighter delayed dozens of factories. This approach required restraint. Submarines passed warships to strike cargo vessels. They avoided unnecessary engagements. Success was measured not by battles won, but by tonnage removed. The impact of the campaign reached far beyond the sea. Cities felt the shortages first. Food became scarce. Fuel rationing intensified. Industrial output fell unpredictably. Military planners were forced to make choices: what units received supplies and which went without. For civilians, the effects were indirect but severe. Transportation slowed. Heating and lighting were limited. The war's burden became heavier even without bombs falling. American commanders understood these consequences. They framed the campaign as a way to shorten the war by undermining Japan's capacity to continue it. The suffering was not ignored, but it was seen as a byproduct of strategic necessity. By late 1944, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking faster than it could be replaced. Routes were abandoned. Ports fell silent. The flow that sustained the empire was breaking. What had once seemed like isolated sinkings now formed a pattern of inevitability. And as this pressure intensified, the campaign reached a point where numbers alone would tell the story, where the balance tipped beyond recovery. That moment would not arrive with a single explosion, but with a realization inside Japanese headquarters that the war had entered a phase from which there was no return. By early 1944, the submarine war in the Pacific had entered its decisive phase. The change was visible in the data long before it was acknowledged in Tokyo. Monthly shipping losses climbed steadily. Entire categories of cargo, oil tankers, coal carriers, troop transports, were disappearing at unsustainable rates. The curve no longer fluctuated. It rose. American submarines now operated with confidence born of experience. Patrol zones were deliberately assigned along Japan's most critical sea lanes. Boats rotated efficiently. When one submarine left an area, another arrived to replace it. The pressure never eased. The South China Sea became a killing ground. Ships carrying oil from Borneo and Sumatra had to pass through narrow corridors where submarines waited. The Luzon Strait, once a routine passage, turned into a zone of constant threat. Approaches to the home islands were no longer safe. In March 1944, Japanese shipping losses reached levels that alarmed even optimistic planners. Tanker sinkings were particularly damaging. Fuel stocks began to collapse. The Imperial Japanese Navy, designed for decisive engagements, found itself unable to train or maneuver. Warships sat idle. Aircraft remained grounded. The effects rippled outward. Factories slowed as raw materials failed to arrive. Steel production dropped. Aircraft output declined. Maintenance backlogs grew. Even when resources existed somewhere in the empire, moving them became dangerous. Japanese countermeasures lagged behind the crisis. Convoy systems were expanded but too late. Escorts were added, but they lacked radar, training, and coordination. Aircraft were diverted to anti-submarine patrols, but fuel shortages limited flight hours. Minefields were laid but submarines adapted. American commanders noted the shift. Patrol reports described fewer ships, but those that appeared were often critical cargo vessels. Each sinking carried disproportionate weight. By mid-1944, submarines accounted for more than half of all Japanese shipping losses. This was no longer a supporting campaign. It was the primary mechanism of economic warfare. The Japanese response became increasingly defensive. Routes were altered, lengthening transit times and increasing exposure. Smaller ships were pressed into service, reducing efficiency. Crews sailed with heightened anxiety, knowing that survival depended on chance rather than protection. Inside Japanese naval headquarters, assessments grew grim. Reports acknowledged that losses exceeded replacement capacity. Shipbuilding programs could not keep pace. The merchant fleet was shrinking month by month. Yet there was no dramatic announcement. No formal admission of defeat. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The war could still be fought. Battles could still be contested. But the ability to sustain those battles, to move fuel, food, and material, was slipping away. This realization did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated like pressure on a hull. And by late 1944, that pressure was nearing the point where even Japan's most hardened planners understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the timing. That understanding would crystallize as the submarine campaign reached its most destructive intensity. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's maritime system was no longer under attack. It was collapsing. Submarine patrols reported something new and unsettling, not heavier resistance but emptier seas. Shipping lanes that once carried steady traffic now yielded only the occasional heavily laden vessel. When those ships appeared, they were often irreplaceable. Oil tankers, ammunition carriers, transports carrying entire units. Each sinking now produced effects far beyond its tonnage. Fuel shortages reached critical levels. The Imperial Japanese Navy was forced to drastically curtail operations. Training exercises were cancelled. Carrier air groups flew fewer hours. Battleships conserved fuel in port, their presence increasingly symbolic rather than operational. The air war felt the impact immediately. Aircraft production slowed due to material shortages. Even completed planes often sat idle, lacking fuel or trained pilots. Defensive coverage weakened. Long-range patrols became rare. On land, the consequences were just as severe. Army units stationed across the empire experienced chronic shortages. Food shipments declined. Ammunition deliveries became irregular. Reinforcements were delayed or never arrived. Garrisons were ordered to live off local resources, accelerating hardship in occupied territories. Japanese planners attempted emergency measures. Shipping was consolidated into larger convoys, making them more visible and harder to conceal. Older warships were reassigned as escorts, reducing combat strength elsewhere. Civilian vessels were requisitioned, despite inadequate speed or protection. None of it reversed the trend. American submarines adapted again. They attacked at night using radar. They struck in shallow coastal waters once considered safe. They mined harbor approaches, forcing ships into predictable routes. The statistics became unavoidable. By early 1945, Japan had lost the majority of its pre-war merchant fleet. Oil imports were a fraction of their former levels. Coal deliveries had fallen sharply. Food imports could no longer meet civilian demand. Inside Japanese leadership circles, assessments acknowledged that even if fighting continued, the capacity to wage modern war had been stripped away. The empire was no longer sustained by flow, but by depletion. This was the turning point, not marked by a single battle but by a realization. Japan could still resist, but it could no longer recover. The submarine campaign had achieved what surface fleets and bombing raids alone could not. It had severed the connective tissue of an empire. It had transformed geography into a weapon. As 1945 began, the consequences of this collapse would shape every remaining decision, military and political alike. And when the war finally ended, the true scale of what had been destroyed beneath the waves would only then come fully into focus. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the measure of Japan's maritime collapse was undeniable. The U.S. submarine campaign had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, accounting for over 5 million tons of cargo. Tankers, essential for fueling both the Navy and industry, were almost entirely destroyed. Of the pre-war fleet of approximately 6 million tons, fewer than a third remained operational. Replacement was impossible. Steel, labor, and fuel shortages made new construction painfully slow, if not outright unfeasible. The consequences went beyond numbers. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a dominant force in the Pacific, had been effectively immobilized. Aircraft carriers could not sortie without fuel. Battleships remained moored. Patrols became rare. Submarine pressure, by severing supply lines, dictated operational capacity before a single major fleet engagement could be decisive. The war had been decided in large part not by guns or bombs, but by the unseen work of submarines cutting Japan's lifelines. Civilian life reflected the same reality. Cities that survived bombing campaigns still faced rationing. Rice, sugar, oil, these essentials arrived sporadically, often through improvised distribution systems. Factories slowed or stopped entirely. Even with Japanese industrial ingenuity, raw materials simply did not arrive. The economy faltered under the weight of logistical collapse. Reports from American commanders emphasized efficiency over glory. Admiral Charles A. Lockwood noted in 1945 that the submarine force had accomplished in quiet months what the fleet could not achieve in years of battle. The campaign, he argued, was a strategic masterpiece, leveraging the cumulative effect of persistent, calculated pressure rather than flashy victories. Meanwhile, Japanese officials attempted post-war explanations. Internal assessments acknowledged that shipping losses were far beyond replacement capacity. A Ministry of the Navy report stated bluntly that the merchant marine vital to sustaining the empire has been rendered incapable of continuing the war. The collapse was systemic, irreversible, and, most importantly, preventable, had attention been paid to logistics earlier in the conflict. Yet, during the war, the effort remained invisible to the public. Submariners returned quietly. Sinkings were logged and analyzed internally, but newspapers highlighted carrier battles and air raids. Few appreciated the scale of the economic war being waged beneath the Pacific waves. The slow strangulation of Japan's supply lines became a model for understanding how industrialized warfare operates. Quantity and persistence, rather than dramatic engagement, defined success. A handful of steel-hulled submarines had done what vast armies and navies could not. They rendered an entire empire unable to move essential resources. The stage was now set to examine the full post-war analysis, including how historians and naval strategists interpreted this campaign, and the broader implications it had on modern naval doctrine. The full scope of the U.S. submarine campaign only became clear after Japan's surrender. Analysts and historians began to quantify the broader impact, linking maritime losses directly to the decline of Japan's military capacity. The merchant fleet had been reduced to a shadow of its pre-war size. Oil imports, which peaked at over 7 million barrels per month before the war, had fallen to a fraction by 1945. Without fuel, Japan's navy could not operate, and its air force could not project power. Even if raw materials existed elsewhere, the means to transport them no longer existed. Strategic assessments emphasized that the campaign had been as much about calculation as courage. The approach of sustained interdiction forced Japan to make choices: which ships to protect, which routes to abandon, and which military operations to delay. Each decision reflected scarcity rather than strategy. The very act of survival became a constant logistical puzzle. American naval leadership viewed the results as confirmation of a new kind of warfare, one where stealth and patience could deliver decisive outcomes. Admiral Lockwood wrote that, "We had discovered that submarines could wage a war on commerce with precision, achieving in months what surface fleets could not in years." The quiet, unglamorous nature of this work belied its immense strategic significance. It was a war fought in shadows, but one whose consequences shaped the visible course of events above the waves. Japanese post-war accounts acknowledged the failure to protect the merchant fleet. The Ministry of Transport and the Navy separately noted that convoy systems had been implemented too late, escorts were inadequate, and critical choke points remained unguarded. Scholars would later identify a crucial factor. Japan underestimated the cumulative effect of losing logistics, assuming that losses were temporary rather than systemic. This misjudgment transformed minor tactical defeats into strategic collapse. The campaign's broader lessons were absorbed into naval doctrine worldwide. Submarines were recognized not just as tactical tools but as instruments of strategic disruption. Modern military planners studied the American approach: intelligence-driven patrols, coordination across the theater, and the deliberate targeting of economic lifelines rather than purely military objectives. It became a blueprint for how undersea warfare could shape an entire conflict without a single decisive battle. Ultimately, the quiet efficiency of the submarine campaign forced Japan into a state of attrition that no fleet or army could remedy. Ports fell silent. Supply chains fractured. Factories slowed. Soldiers went unfed. The empire's lifeblood was cut, and the war's outcome was sealed long before the first atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. The human cost was present but diffuse. Civilians and military personnel alike suffered shortages. Yet the campaign's effectiveness demonstrated that wars could be decided not solely by combat, but by the management, or denial, of movement and resources. From these depths rose a lesson for all navies: power is as much about flow as force. With the consequences fully realized, the final reflection emerges: a contemplation on the nature of invisible warfare, systemic strategy, and the quiet, decisive power of patience beneath the waves. The Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets well. Beneath its waves, steel boats slipped silently, striking without spectacle, shaping the fate of an empire. The U.S. submarine campaign against Japan did not produce iconic battles or dramatic headlines. Its victories were measured in tons of cargo, miles of disrupted supply lines, and the slow suffocation of a nation's lifeblood. Yet in that quiet, the course of history was rewritten. This was a war waged on patience, calculation, and endurance. Men lived in confined steel tubes, enduring months of isolation, danger, and monotony. Technology, torpedoes, radar, sonar, was adapted, corrected, and refined. Leadership made the hard decisions to focus on systemic effect over immediate glory. Every sinking, every disrupted convoy, every calculated patrol contributed to a strategy that was invisible in the moment but irreversible in outcome. The moral paradox is undeniable. Civilian suffering, industrial paralysis, and logistical collapse were consequences of a campaign designed to shorten the war and save lives in the long term. Yet the principle was clear. Wars can be decided not only by the flash of gunfire but by controlling what moves and what cannot. Denial, pressure, and foresight became as lethal as bombs or bullets. In the end, the campaign reshaped naval doctrine worldwide. Submarines became instruments of systemic strategy, capable of striking at the unseen structures that sustain conflict. The lesson remains timeless. Power lies not only in confrontation, but in understanding and exploiting the networks that sustain an enemy. And so, beneath the calm surface of the Pacific, history remembers a quiet form of mastery, one that proved empires could be undone not by spectacle, but by the slow, deliberate application of pressure, wave by wave, ship by ship, until the currents themselves carried the message of inevitable defeat. The war above the waves had been fought, but the victory beneath them had already been secured.